Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the latest chapter of Tales from the Triverse, my ongoing science fiction fantasy detective serial. In the story so far, Lola Stiles, reunited with her old detective colleagues, has been bringing them up to date on all of her recent escapades. This week's chapter is called Collectibles. Addis Ababa, 1980, February. Jesus H. Christ, Holland said, pushing himself reluctantly to his feet and groaning as if he'd been sat there for days. This might be better if someone had brought me a beer, but I didn't travel across half the solar system for Lola Stiles' autobiography. He crossed the room from the corner where he'd been lurking and took one of the cups of coffee from the table, where Detective Burhane had just poured around. Standing with her arms crossed, and a frown almost as crossed, Lola sighed. "Frank, there's a lot to explain. It's complicated." "Okay, but it's all set up," he complained. "Do I give a shit about Professor Pavlova? No. Am I happy that you escaped from Brulia and are standing before us? Well, sure, but fuck, I don't need to know all about your little scampering elf friends." He took a sip of the coffee and appeared to almost retch. "Shit me, what is this? Coffee or mud?" "I rather like it," Chakraborty said, before Holland could continue. "It's thick." "Thank you, Detective Chakraborty," Burhane said, nodding gratefully and sipping from his own cup. "It's a more traditional method. One of the concourse cafes specialises in it." "I'm sorry," Holland said, pacing the room and gesticulating with one arm. "I didn't mean to give the impression that I give a shit about coffee and would like to have an entire fucking conversation about it. How about we try to not get distracted? Can we try that as a group?" He pointed to Chakraborty and Kaminsky, then to Clark and to himself. "And let's not forget, none of us are detectives anymore. Our Ethiopian friend here is the only one of us with an actual job." The man was insufferable. At least that hadn't changed. Clark was still processing everything Lola had said, but he felt compelled to at least stand up for his own reputation. "I am in fact still a detective, Holland," he said. "Private Dick, wow." Holland looked at Lola like a dog begging for scraps. "Come on, why are we here? Other than a lovely reunion. Like I say, I'm happy you're not dead, I really am, but give me a break." Clark was fitting the pieces together, at first presuming that Lola had been able to reach mid-Earth due to the Palanese rebels taking over the Atlantic portal. He was now thinking it wasn't quite that. She'd been at the heart of that particular rebellion. He'd read the name Christian, or heard it somewhere, perhaps in an anti-terrorism report in those final months of the SDC, just before their lives all got flipped upside down. The leader of the so-called Okehu, a dispersed collection of loosely affiliated insurgents that had been blamed for the Kengto larvae incident at the portal station back in 1974. That report would have come down from Scotland Yard after Lola was already posted to Brulia, so there was a good chance it never reached her desk. They'd all had to make the best of it since leaving London, but Lola had made some particularly odd friends. "Fair enough," Lola said, relenting and pulling something from a rucksack on one of the seats. She unfurled the paper and placed it on the table in front of them all. "This is the New Sangma Museum," she said, tapping the poorly reproduced photograph. "It's a treasure trove of artefacts from across the Triverse, half of them stolen, of course, including relics from Palinor." Even Holland stayed silent, wondering where she was going. Another image was pulled from her bag, this time a pencil sketch of a library. "These are the journals of a Palanese wielder from 2 centuries back. His name was Cainamore." "I know that name," Kaminsky said, holding up his hand as if in a classroom. "Didn't he have something to do with the joining in the first place?" Clark shook his head. The Brulian University always denied any involvement in the opening of the portals. He was one of the lecturers who died in the blast. "Yeah," Lola said. "He was the one that created the portals in the first place and linked our worlds together." Holland held out a hand in protest. "Hold on, sister. That's a very confident claim you just made." "Most of his laboratory was destroyed when the portals opened, except for some of his books. In the early days of the joining, nobody knew what was going on, and some of his journals went missing." Smiling, Clark folded his arms across his chest. "And now they're in the New Sangma Museum." Lola pointed at him excitedly, as if he'd won a prize. "That's it." Holding his hands to his head, Holland turned away from them all and uttered a low moan. "Why are we talking about a museum? What about your professor that you rescued? Are you going to tell us what that was all about?" She blinked a few times as if forgetting where she was. "Oh, right. Samova was one of the consultants on the Yvette Field case. He oversaw her surgery, did some of it himself. That caught Holland's attention. Field, the schoolgirl attack that was blamed on a cough. The same? It was Professor Samova who got her back to being halfway healthy. Huh, Holland said, turning the information over in his head. I always wondered what happened to her. Kaminsky laughed, a disparaging sound rather than one of humour. He didn't even look into it. Case was closed, Holland said with a shrug. None of my business after that. Shifting in his seat, Clark cleared his throat. He'd had enough of tangents for the day. Why was he on the run? What did he know? He'd sent Yvette Field back to mid-Earth once she was recovered, at least physically, Lola said. Turns out he was in a hurry to get her off Palinor. What he didn't report at the time was that he'd detected signs of wielding ability in her. Very small, very latent. Nothing that she could use or even be aware of, but a flicker that shouldn't have been there. There was a stunned silence in the room. Burhane whistled, long and low. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Clark took a deep breath, trying to understand the implications. She'd had that from the start, and it became apparent as soon as she was taken to Palinor? Not according to Samova. It was only after the surgery and the rebonding processes. Field was extensively wounded from the attack, would have died on mid-Earth. She was the first to receive treatment that combined mid-Earth surgery with Palinese magic. Everyone was very excited at the time, but the program was shut down once portal travel got restricted. Hold on, said Chakraborty, leaning back in her chair and lifting her feet onto the table. Are you saying this girl could do magic? Lola shook her head. Not properly, no. She wasn't even aware of any of this. It was only in Samova's tests that he detected some latent ability. It was unexpected, an accident, but it upended everything we know about how wielding works. It's always been limited to humans born on Palinor with multi-generational Palinese heritage. Ainfa can't do it. Koth only wield in a passive manner. Nobody from Mid-Earth or Max-Earth has ever demonstrated any kind of aptitude. If true, it would be a paradigm shift. Clark recognised that immediately. Was it the surgery then? That was Samova's theory. He didn't include it in his reports and got Field back to Mid-Earth ASAP. Why? Asked Chakraborty. Holland sneered. Because everyone would want a piece of her if they'd known. She'd have been chopped up into little pieces to try to figure out how to do it again, to make it more effective. Not just that, Lola said. This knowledge would upend the fabric of Palinese society. There's a lot of pride in being the only people in the Triverse able to wield magic. This discovery would suggest that maybe they're not quite so unique. And remember, wielding abilities are inseparable from most Palinese religions. It's all intertwined. And if this is possible, then perhaps Ainfa could regain their wielding abilities too. Everything changes. Wait, Kaminsky said, frowning. Ainfa can do magic? Not anymore. Legend has it that they could a long time ago. Legend? Holland snorted. Give me a break. So, what happened? Samova got found out? Someone stumbled on his research notes. He wasn't popular at the university anyway, didn't kiss the ring of the Chancellor nearly enough. So they decided he should have a little accident. Instead, his attacker was killed and Samova had to leave the city. That's when we picked him up. Clark abruptly pushed back his chair and got to his feet. His heart was hammering. So we've got recorded evidence of conspiracy within the Joint Council. You've got evidence that everything the university says and does is a pack of lies. He looked at his friends, at his colleagues. Is it enough? I was surprised you hadn't already released the recordings of Hutchinson once you made it to Max-Earth. He shook his head. Miller was dead. The recording on its own wasn't enough, and it was too old. We needed a proper witness. Recorded evidence is too easily faked, especially with the government back in London. They'd just dismiss it as fake news. The data card had been uploaded to Justin's core as soon as they'd got to Max-Earth. It was safe, should the perfect opportunity arise for them to use it. Does the Field girl know about any of this? Holland looked like he was taking matters seriously for the first time. For a moment, it looked to Clark like the other man actually cared about something. Not as far as I know, Lola said with a shake of her head. The whole point of trying to take out Samova was to keep this quiet. The rebels are sitting on it for now. The rebels, Clark said, leaning his hands on the back of his seat. They took back the Atlantic portal station. That's presumably how you managed to get back to Mid-Earth. The London portals are still shut down. Lola smiled. It's a bit more complicated than that, but yes. She hesitated, seemingly wanting to say more. For the first time, Clark wished that the others weren't in the room. Perhaps she would open up if they could speak privately, just the two of them. "All right," Holland said. "Come on then. Why is there a pretty picture of a fucking museum on the table? What's so important about some old diaries?" "We need those missing journals," she said. "We think they contain information vital to the rebellion and also to everyone in the Triverse. They could change everything." Clark looked over to Holland, who returned his glance. Holland raised his eyebrows and flicked his thumb in Lola's direction. "Could change everything, Clark. Was your partner always this dramatic?" He started clapping. A+ for your drama lessons, Styles. She ignored him, looked instead to Clark, then over to Kaminsky and Chakraborty, and finally to Burhane, who was leaning against the wall, observing quietly, saying little. "There are 4 active portals. The 2 in London, here on Mid-Earth. One goes to Palinor, the other to Max-Earth. There's another here in Addis, which goes to Max-Earth, and the final one is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which goes to Palinor." She took a breath. "But there are 2 more, which have always been there, but they've never worked. One is in Brulia, the other in London on Max-Earth. Dormant portals. They don't lead anywhere." "They've always given me the creeps," Kaminsky said, shuddering. "They don't work because Kanemor's spell was never completed. If they worked, it's likely they'd provide a direct link between Palinor and Max-Earth." "That seems like a bit of a guess," Holland said. "Why would you think that?" "I know people who have studied this their whole lives. Samova is an expert in portal physics, and that's not all. We think we can complete the spell and get those portals working." Groaning, Clark walked away from the table. It was all too much. One wild claim after another. He'd hoped for a peaceful reunion, a moment where they could all be together without having the weight of 3 worlds on their shoulders. Apparently, that wasn't an option. A direct link between Palinor and Max-Earth would cut London out of the picture. Mid-Earth would no longer be the central hub for travel and trade. "That is a startling thought," Burhane said, the sound of his voice surprising everyone in the room, and not a little concerning. "The UAC has benefited greatly from our unique link with Max-Earth." Holland was laughing. That would seriously take the wind out of Earth First's sails. The Empire has been propped up by the Joint Council for decades. Lola's words were catching in Clark's mind. "You said, 'We think we can complete the spell,'" he said. "Who is we?" "My associates, the ones who rescued me." "Okay, who?" She blinked a few too many times. "Some have used that name. We try to avoid labels. It makes us vulnerable." Lola Styles, the rebel. Lola Styles, the Palinese terrorist. His fears were realised then. "None of this works without Kanemor's journals," she said, trying to move past the awkward moment. "That's why I need your help. All of you. I need you to help me steal them from the museum." Another silence, broken only by the chorus of thunks as their jaws hit the floor, one after another. Detective Burhane was the first to speak. "You do know I am still a serving police officer, yes? You also know about what's happening with the Joint Council. You know about the rogue AI they've constructed. Why do you think every country's economies are tanking, except for the Kingdom of Great Britain, the Brulian city-state, and some select trillionaires on Max-Earth? You know this is bigger and more important than anything else." "Before we all get carried away," Holland said, holding up his hands, "can you please just tell us why you've got blue and red hands? I really can't wait any longer." "That's fair," she said. "It's hard to talk about even now, but you need to know everything. It happened when we visited a town called Lairn." And that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. You can find a lot more, leave comments and all of that good stuff over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.